Okay, we're going to begin. Some people are still joining, but I hope that we have a lot to say today in a limited time, so we're going to get started. I'm Michael Shredden. I'm at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'll moderate the session today. We have a really important topic and a wonderful speakers and a really excellent panel. The topic today, as you know, is social work and social policy. And this topic is an important one. Social work has historically always had a strong influence in social policy. It's not always appreciated as much as I think it should be appreciated. So I'm happy to lift up this topic. And the people in this session are really leaders in their own countries and really globally in this topic of social work's engagement in social policy. We couldn't have today a better group of people to address this topic. And as a core for the session, there's a really wonderful book that's just been written by our two main speakers, Idit Weiss-Gal and John Gall. And the topic is when social workers impact social policy and don't just implement it. I like the title. I like the second part of the title that makes, drives the point home. Don't just implement it, but impact and help to create social policy. And that'll be our main perspective today. I want to give a special welcome to Professors John Gall and Idit Weiss-Gal, both of them very well known internationally. John is at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Idit is at Tel Aviv University, where they also have provided leadership in heading social work programs and many other things. And we've been colleagues for a long time and have actually held a couple of conferences on this topic. At least one in St. Louis and one in Jerusalem. We have really wonderful panelists today. Miss Sarah Butts is doing policy leadership at the National Association of Social Workers, where she's doing a really energetic job. I've told Sarah this, and I will tell you, she's the most effective policy person we've had at NASW in a long time, and we really appreciate that leadership. Dr. Charles Lewis is coming to us. He's the founding director of CRISP, which is the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy. Charles provides real active policy leadership on Capitol Hill. He doesn't always say this, but he also was very instrumental in creating the Social Work Congressional Caucus for the U.S. Congress. Really invaluable partner and expert on this topic. We have Professor Hussein Latif, who's my colleague at the Brown School, and Professor Latif heads the social policy curriculum for our school, and has a lot of perspectives from that point of view of how to teach social policy. And today we're talking about a social policy text. So Dr. Latif's comments here will be very helpful. And we have Ricardo Udy from the University of Pisa. He's a professor in sociology, but also very active. I should say that John and Idit and Ricardo are three of the leaders, probably the three main leaders in the European Association for Social Work and Social Policy. So they're also very long-term colleagues. And so that's it. It's an excellent group. I also want to give a word of thanks here to some other people, our key people at Center for Social Development who put this together. Ms. Tanika Spencer, who's done a lot of the organizing. Ms. Lissa Johnson, Associate Director of the Center, always helps us put many things together, including this session. And Chris Leiker, our really excellent Director of Communications, who has provided communications before and will provide communications after this event. And also at the Brown School and Washington University, Brandon Hentz, who's providing technical support. So that's our crew today. great colleagues to work with. Let me say a word of thanks to my Center for Social Development. I want to also acknowledge the Policy Press, an imprint from Bristol University Press in the United Kingdom, which is the publisher for the book that we're talking about today. The Council for Social Work Education in the United States, Grand Challenges for Social Work, which is a U.S. initiative to identify future challenges, and really the source of, we hope, increasing policy innovation. Dr. Lewis's group, CRIS, the Congressional Research Institute for Social Policy and Social Work, Influencing Social Policy, and Gary Parker. Parker is part of the audience today. Influencing Social Policy is a social work organization with mostly academics who are teaching and trying to influence social policy in their research. The National Association of Social Workers, the International Consortium for Social Development, and the Special Commission to Advance Macro Practice in Social Work. So we have terrific support from many places, and I think because of this support, we also have a very large audience in participating, and that's really welcome for all of us. So we hope that people enjoy this session and find it meaningful, and we'll take a look at the textbook that's been written about social work and social policy by John and Idit. And in that regard, there is a discount code on the final resting page for this session, and you will all be emailed, all the participants will be emailed this discount code for purchase of the textbook in case you're interested in doing that. I think that's all the introductions that I need to do, and actually save a little bit of time for more interesting things. So I'm gonna turn this over to John and Idit to talk about the book, and we're putting our best foot forward. Idit is going to begin, and John is going to wrap up the session. So, Professor Weiss-Gal.
Okay, you can see the screen. Everything is fine. Okay. So, Michael, thank you for your kind words, for your support and friendship over the years, and of course, for initiating this event. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. We are very happy to see you all here and hope that you find the event interesting. We would like to thank the sponsoring partners of this book event, and in particular, the folks at the Center for Social Development and the School of Social Work at WashU, Chris, Tenika, and Lisa. Thank you for all your efforts to make this happen and to bring together a wonderful panel. We look forward to the panel members' questions and to any comments and questions from the audience. Let me begin by describing. Do you hear me? Everything is fine? Yes? Let me know if everything is fine and you can hear me.
It's a little bit garbled. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So let me begin describing what we think are the 5 main issues that the international social work investigation community deals with in its research. So I hope now it's better. Do you hear me better?
Yes, we can hear you better. Thanks.
Yes. Okay. So Let me begin by describing what we think are the 5 main issues that the international social work policy engagement community deals with in its research. The first of these relates to the types of policy engagement. Scholars have identified different routes by which social workers impact policy: civic versus professional, individual versus collective, implementation versus design. A second issue includes diverse questions which have sought to better understand the how question. What are the strategies that social workers employ as individuals and collectively, as citizens and as professionals, in order to influence different stages of the policy-making cycle? What are the policy areas they are involved in? What are their inputs in the policy-making processes? The third issue is the factors associated with the policy engagement of social workers. The main questions here are why and when do social workers engage in policy processes? A fourth issue is the policy impact of social workers. It seeks to describe what social workers achieve in terms of policy outcomes and to identify the factors that lead to success or failure of these efforts. A final issue focuses on factors. The research and the scholarly discussion in this case concentrate on questions pertaining to social work education and its role in creating and advancing policy engagement. How can we educate social workers to be effective policy actors? What are the contexts, the didactic tools and strategies, the implicit and explicit curricula necessary to develop the desire, the willingness, and the ability to integrate policy activities into the practice of all social workers, or at least most of them? Around each of these issues, a growing and substantive body of research and discourse have emerged over the last decades. Our book relates primarily to the third issue, the effort to understand why and when social workers engage in different routes of policy engagement. What are the factors associated with social workers' policy engagement? The core of our book is a policy engagement framework that we developed over the last decade. The framework is based upon diverse theoretical and conceptual sources from social work and from other disciplines. Empirically, it draws upon our own research and that of other scholars, mainly, but not exclusively, within social work. The goal of the framework is to identify factors that affect the policy engagement of individual social workers, be they professionals whose prime task is to deal with policy issues as policy experts, or by frontline social workers, be they direct, clinical, or community social workers, whose prime professional tasks do not necessarily focus on actively engaging in the policy processes. In other words, what leads social workers to seek impact policy by diverse routes? What affects their decision to stand, to speak, and to act? It is important to say that we are not trying to explain the policy involvement of social work organizations, be they service providers or professional organizations. Other colleagues, and particularly Ricardo Guidi, are doing much in that regard. Although we think that our framework may serve as a point of departure for this theoretical effort. The framework includes 4 categories of factors. 3 of them, opportunity, facilitation, and motivation, may be familiar to those of you who know the earlier version of this framework. These three categories comprise of diverse variables that we think impact social workers' policy engagement directly. The fourth, an additional category, environments, directly affects these three categories, so its influence on the policy engagement of social workers is mediated by them. Let me now concentrate on the independent variable. What we would like to explain, social workers' policy engagement. This includes 6 different routes by which social workers impact policies. These are the routes through which social workers choose to respond to social problems and policies by engaging in policy formulation, and they can take place on the organizational, local, regional, or national levels. 2 of these routes occur in the civic sphere, with social workers acting as citizens in the political processes. The additional 4 routes are those in which social workers engage in as professionals. The civic routes are voluntary political participation, such as voting and protesting. This is something that we are doing a lot in the last few weeks in Israel, and holding elected office. Social workers engage in these routes as private citizens and not in their formal capacity as professional social workers. The 4 professional routes include, firstly, street-level policy involvement. This professional route is unique in that it consists of social workers' involvement in impacting policies on the ground through their actions and decisions as frontline practitioners or as managers of social services. The second professional route is policy practice. We think of policy practice as one of ongoing intentional professional activities undertaking to impact the design of policies by social workers on their own initiative or that of others as integral part of their professional work in diverse fields and types of practice. A third professional route is policy involvement by social work organizations, either by proxy or through recruitment networks. Academic policy practice is the 4th professional route. It refers to the involvement of social work faculty and students in policy-related activities through university community partnerships, teaching, and/or individual engagement. Of course, not all the factors in the framework are relevant to all the routes that social workers can follow to engage in policy change, nor is there sufficient data to support everything. However, we believe that the framework does offer us a useful perspective on all the routes. And now, Johnny will describe the 4 categories of variables that we believe explain the why and the how of social workers' policy involvement in these routes.
Hi, so let me begin with the first of the variable categories, which, as Idit said, we call environments. A key insight that we have taken from reactions to our work in recent years is that structural, social, and professional environments have a potentially indirect impact on decisions by social workers to engage or not in policy routes. This impact is difficult to untangle, but is clearly important and was missing in our earlier thinking. In the framework, we relate to 4 such environments: welfare regime, policies and problems, the profession, and people. Well, really service users, but we like using the Ps. So let me touch on 2 of the 4 environments very briefly. The first of these is what we call policies and problems. Often in the social work literature, we find the implicit or explicit assumption that the severity of specific social problems or the nature of policies adopted to address these think of austerity or new public management, will increase the motivation of social workers to engage in policy and will lead them to play a role in order to deal with the problem or rectify the policy. And indeed, there is, of course, evidence of this. An early historical example is the terrible state of children in poor, mainly immigrant families in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. As Francisco Branco has shown, the severity of the conditions of children encouraged social workers to advocate for and eventually succeed in bringing about the establishment of the Children's Bureau in 1912. Yet while severe social problems can, and indeed do, motivate social workers to engage more in policy, this is not always the case. Sometimes these severe problems, or the policies adopted to address them, appear to create apathy or a sense of helplessness among social workers. The ways in which social workers reacted in the policy arena to the economic crisis and to the austerity during the Great Recession reflects this. Research by Pastor Seller, Guidi, and others shows that this crisis led to a very significant and indeed remarkable mobilization for policy change among Spanish social workers, and it culminated in the so-called Orange Tide protests. However, in other Mediterranean welfare states in which harsh austerity policies were also adopted, in Greece, Italy, and Portugal, there is little evidence of this type of mobilization. Our conclusion from this is that severity of social problems and the nature of policies is an important environmental factor, but it is linked to others, and in particular to the second factor that I want to discuss, the profession. Here the assumption is that when the social work profession is strongly embedded in a society, advocates for policy engagement and structural solutions, and supports this through professional socialization and professional discourse, we are likely to find a more conducive environment for policy engagement on the part of social workers. Societal recognition will create more opportunities for policy engagement. If social workers are able to attain leadership positions in social services, this will facilitate the participation of social work staff in policy processes. And due to encouragement and training in policy during their education and afterwards, social workers will be motivated to engage in policy and have the self-efficacy to do so. Evidence of this can be found in a series of cross-national comparative studies undertaken by Mel Gray and her colleagues in the early years of the millennium. They identified greater policy engagement among social workers in New Zealand in comparison to their colleagues in Australia, in South Africa, and Hong Kong. The authors explained this by underscoring the more activist and structural approach adopted by the social work profession in New Zealand. Our comparative work on policy practice also found a greater level of policy engagement by social workers in Spain, Israel, and the United States. These were also the countries in which a pro-policy engagement sentiment was most present in the professional discourse, and the profession was more embedded in society. I hope that these brief discussions of the impact of environments will offer you a sense of why we think that context is important for better understanding why social workers engage in policy. Based on what we know, we are also convinced that environments are most potent when various environmental factors combine. They will create the context for policy engagement and can impact opportunity, facilitation, and motivation. So let me then move on to the first of these three categories, opportunity. Our point of departure here is that policy efforts are only possible if social workers have access to the policy process and to policy institutions. The access issue will be crucial in determining if and how social workers affect policy. Strangely, it is often absent in much of the writing on the policy engagement of social workers. A notion that emerged in the social movement research, opportunity structures, helped to clarify our thinking in this context. It is not enough to want to impact policy. You have to find a way to do so, to access the places where policy is decided. Under what conditions do social workers have opportunities to access policy processes? How does this occur on different policy levels? Neo-institutionalism offers a useful way to answer these questions. It conceptualized political and bureaucratic institutions as collections of rules and organizational practices. It is all about how are things decided and what is decided, but also who has access to the process, or to put it more crudely, who is at the table. Using these concepts, we explore opportunity on 3 levels of policy making: the national, the local, and the street level. And we ask, how do social workers access the policy process on each of these levels? We observe that on the national level, different institutional rules and norms lead social workers seeking access to the policy process to adopt distinctive forms of policy engagement in different countries. So if they want to access the policy process, social workers in the United States will typically engage in lobbying on the state or federal levels, often supported by professional organizations such as the NASW. This reflects the rules and norms of political institutions in the United States. In the UK, by contrast, social workers often participate in green paper consultation processes, while in Israel, access to the process is easiest for social workers through parliamentary committees. The norms and informal rules in these committees encourage external participation in them, and this explains the relatively high level of social work participation in these committees. The local level is where social workers are most likely to engage in the policy practice route to seek policy change. Here, our perspective was influenced by Vivian Lowndes' studies on local government in the UK and her employment of a term coined by neo-institutional theorist Elinor Ostrom, rules in use. This refers to a combination of formal and informal institutional rules that determine access and participation in local government policy processes. Our research on social work policy entrepreneurs underscores very clearly how important it is that social workers seeking to create policy change know the formal rules regarding local policy processes, its hierarchy, and formal structures. But crucial also are the informal ways in which policy is decided in a specific locality. Employing this knowledge enabled the social work policy entrepreneurs to be able to further local policy change. When looking at the third policy level, the street level policy level engagement, we think of professional discretion as opportunity. In other words, we look at policy processes that take place in a specific institutional context, that in which street level social workers have the capacity, either formally or informally, to engage in policy formulation within the social services in which they are employed. When they have this discretion, it enables them to affect the working of their organizations and the lives of their service users in ways which are relatively unaffected by external actors, even those within local government. Now let me move on to facilitation. Most social workers are, of course, employed in organizations. So it is fair to assume that the organizational context will have a predominant effect on the willingness of social workers to engage in policy and on the forms that this will take. This is what we call facilitation. How and why do organizations facilitate this engagement? And what form of policy engagement do they support? A useful way to begin a discussion on facilitation is to think about the organizations in which social workers are employed as institutions. Institutions are affected by policies that are decided upon by different levels of government. This is the case for non-profit, for-profit, and for governmental agencies on the national and local levels. These organizations and their employees are required to impact policy processes to protect or further their specific interests and goals and those of whom they serve. They will do so according to the rules and to the norms existent in the policy process relevant to them. The organization's efforts to determine how and when their social work employees participate in policy processes will be reflected in their organizational culture. In our book, we explore the policy engagement of social workers in different types of organizations, advocacy organizations and non-profit social service providers, and the way this is linked to the organizational culture in these organizations. Here I would like to elaborate a bit on a third type of organization, the government. Because it is both an employer of social workers and it is where policy is also made, the government is a complex but important focus of the study of facilitation. While some social workers serve as elected or appointed officials in the government bureaucracy, and this enables them to engage in policy on a daily basis, I've heard actually that in Arizona this is now the case. But most social workers are employees of national and particularly local government. So clearly the policy engagement of these social workers will be much dependent on the organizational culture of their workplace and the way it views policy engagement. When is the organizational culture in a government organization likely to encourage one of the types of policy engagement? This is apparently impacted by legislation determining the boundaries of political involvement, the Hatch Act in the United States, by a broader public service ethos, and by formal codes of ethics and mission statements and the way they view policy engagement. Is it acceptable, tolerated, or encouraged? Often local government policy perspectives and the leadership in specific agencies will also contribute much to this culture. We have found that the dominance of political leadership in local social policy making, or rather the lack of this, alongside the degree to which social workers have a leadership role in local social services, and the degree to which their professional ethos encourages policy engagement, can contribute to an organizational culture conducive to policy participation by social workers. And now to the final category of factors, motivation. So social workers are, of course, individuals with agency. And that's regardless of organizational support, opportunities, or context, their decision to engage in a policy-related act will be influenced by their own motivation to do so. Thus, the third category deals with individual motivation. In our conceptual framework, we have tried to identify what our research and that of others tells us about the factors that impact social workers' motivation to engage in policy through the different routes. Let me touch on some of these factors. The civic voluntarism model, which was formulated by Sidney Verba and his colleagues, explains why people vote and exercise their democratic rights. It still plays a well-deserved central role in the political science literature by underscoring the impact that the personal resources, psychological engagement in politics, and belonging to a recruitment network have on people's political engagement. Though the Verba model has been shown to be very useful in explaining social workers' voluntary participation and their running for elected office, you can see the work done by Tobias Kindler and his colleagues, for example, it has its limitation when employed to explore other routes of policy engagement, particularly policy practice. We suggest that scholars move beyond this attachment to civic voluntarism and explore additional sources of motivation for policy engagement. One such source of motivation is social workers' personal values and professional attitudes, particularly with regard to the importance of policy engagement, and it can be seen, of course, to reflect professional socialization. The importance of values emerge in studies by Idit and her students on the reasons cited for policy engagement among community workers, but it also appears in work on street-level policy engagement by various authors. Another intriguing way to better understand social workers' policy motivation is to look at the role of personality traits. In a recent original contribution, Talia Schwartz-Tyree found that the willingness of social work students to engage in policy practice was significantly associated with some of the big 5 personality traits, particularly openness to experience, conscientiousness, and extroversion. Finally, initial research indicates that two additional, though under-researched sources of motivation are gender and ethnicity. Studies in the United States and Israel indicate that gender differences appear to impact the motivation of social workers to adopt different forms of policy engagement. Meanwhile, a growing body of work on the impact of ethnicity, much of it undertaken by our colleagues Hani Neumann and Faisal Azaiza, shows that membership of an ethnic minority tends to lead to greater policy engagement, but that its contours are much impacted by the unique status and culture of the minority. A discussion of the two remaining motivational factors that we relate to in our book, institution-based motivation and public service motivation, will have to wait until your questions for another event. So I think I'll stop here and let Idit add a concluding remark.
Thank you, Johnny. So, in his description of the model, Johnny discussed the way environments provide the context and how opportunity, facilitation, and motivation affect social workers' policy engagement. However, we understand that reality is more complex. So let me briefly discuss one interesting arrow in our framework. I refer to the arrow between motivation and opportunity, this one. Our claim is that social workers have the agency to influence opportunities and specifically expand the opportunities for their policy engagement. In other words, social workers can affect the rules that determine the behavior of different policy actors in the policy-making processes. We saw this, for example, in a study on community social workers who were involved in policy practice at the local level. They did this by initiating change in their access to policy formulation forums. They convinced the mayor to set formal institutional rules that ensured the place of social workers in the discussion of specific subjects or problems. In this case, the subject was citizen participation. Their demand was that social workers must be at the table. In other words, the social workers created new rules that widened their opportunities to be policy actors. By way of conclusion, here is a depiction of the full conceptual framework. I hope that it makes more sense now. We can, of course, discuss further the framework, its categories, and the links between its components, but I think that by now you have got the general idea. We believe that if our community is serious about policy engagement being an integral part of what social workers can and should do, then we need to better understand what affects this. Hopefully, we have managed to show you that the policy engagement conceptual framework can contribute to moving this effort forward. So we look forward to questions and comments from the panel and other participants. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John and Idit, for excellent presentations. Some really a very nice outline of the book kind of key perspective. I will say the book is also much richer than that with examples and both evidence. We're talking evidence-based scholarship here, evidence and lessons for social work engagement and policy and practice. We're going to turn now to our panel, and the panelists have questions for the presenters. We don't have too much time for each panelist, but we're going to we hope we'll get some very incisive questions here. Let me say also that while we're doing this, if participants pose questions on the chat, then I will sort through. I won't be able to use all of the questions, but if participants have questions that they want the whole group to respond to, please post them and I'll do my best to bring them up in the final session. So we're going to begin with in the order that the panelists are listed. So Sarah Butts, will you please begin by posing a question to Professors Gal and Weiss-Gal?
Yes, thank you, Michael. And thank you for this excellent presentation and for this book. My question, and I'd like to provide a little context about this, is how can we inspire all social workers, despite their roles or professional positions, to become more engaged in advocacy and public policy? You described the civic routes and professional routes, and you also cite the NESW Code of Ethics, which calls us as social workers in Section 6 to have an ethical responsibility to the broader society. But yet in the book, it actually says, and this section really resonated with me, that content analysis of social workers' involvement in policy processes in the US has found that only a very small number of social workers give testimony at public hearings, send written comments on proposed legislative change, or make use of opportunities to impact regulations. This is something that I am engaged and NESW staff are engaged on a regular basis. So how do we inspire all social workers to become more involved?
Okay, so Johnny, I will take this question. So let me begin by describing who I think are the most, institutions that have the responsibility to inspire all social workers. And I think these are the schools of social works and the professional organizations. And both of them can do a lot in order to inspire social workers. So if I speak firstly on the schools of social work, well, I think there are a lot of things to do, especially in the explicit and the implicit curricula. And I think the first thing is that we need to install the perception that all social workers can engage in policy. And not only experts and not only social workers in specific positions. And this is very, very important to do from the beginning of the professional socialization and to show them how everyone can do something. It's not necessarily should be big engagement or substantive engagements. It can be only to write a letter to a policymakers, only once even, but to do something in order to put the problems that you see on the agenda, on the public agenda, on policymakers' agenda. So the perception that all social workers can engage in policy is something that is very important to do by social work schools. And I think that these schools should give examples of this and to bring social workers to the schools of social work, that they will tell about their experience and even about their success and not only on their failure. And I think that the faculty member can be role models also, and to bring to the class their own engagement in policy and their dilemmas and their difficulties, but also their impact. And it's very, very important. And then after the students are graduated, the professional associations, I think they have a very, very important task to initiate by different tools, to do conferences on to give examples, to publish social workers that engage in policy, to make courses for social workers. For example, our association in Israel, they initiated a course for social workers, how to impact policy through parliamentary committees or conversations with parliamentary members. So the professional association can teach, can publish, can give this activity of policy engagement, visibility that the social workers can see and can be even proud of what they are seeing. I hope I answer you, Sarah.
These are excellent recommendations. Thank you so much. I think you just inspired many social workers with your remarks.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Micah?
Oh, sorry. That really was a great question and really a rich response. And we're going to keep moving to the next panelist, Dr. Charles Lewis. Charles.
Thank you, and I just want to commend you for a really outstanding job in terms of putting the book together. I really appreciate the hard work that went into it, and it stimulates so many thoughts that we really don't have time to even scratch the surface. But I want to focus more narrowly on one idea that Idit suggested in her opening remarks in terms of where we can put our attention. One is in strategies in the political arena. So I consider myself, I actually self-identify as a political social worker, even though there is no such real formal identity, but also in creating policy actors. So one of the things that we do is we focus on Congress on a national level because we feel that that's enough. You know, someone has to focus on Congress. So having spent time in Congress and working with Mr. Towns and creating the Congressional Social Work Caucus, one of the reasons is that it provides a group of Congress members who have at least committed to the ideals and principles of the social work profession, and then it becomes, and we can create political actors out of them if we can motivate them to take our initiatives and try to move them forward on the Hill. And so one of the ways we do that, of course, is research. But many times the research that's being done by social workers is not really connected to the research, to the deliberations that are happening on the Hill. And I'm wondering, can the policy engagement framework help us to move in that direction of focusing or refocusing some of our research, that it would have more influence on the Hill?
Wow, okay, that's a nice question, Charles. Idit and I heard you, I think, 10 years ago at a week we spent in Washington with Gary Parker and his colleagues, and you inspired us then. And in fact, ever since, we've done courses in our parliament on how to influence members of parliament. So thank you for that. And with regard to the question, the question, of course, is how do we expect social work academics, at what stage in the policy process, or how in the policy process do we expect social work academics to have an impact on policy? So, of course, in social work schools, we do research for different reasons, and of course to create theory, and not, of course, not all of it is intended to have an impact on policy. Our experience is that what we should try to do is do research and then try to translate that research into policy or into policy recommendations and make it relevant to policy makers. Policy makers aren't interested in reading our great articles in social work or SSR. They're interested in policy recommendations, maybe a bit of background, but really they want policy recommendations. We can do that if we take our research and try to translate it into the language, into something that has meaning for policymakers. I'm not always sure that the goal is to give very clear-cut recommendations for policy. Sometimes our role is to raise issues, to place them on the agenda through our research, and people do that very often. Sometimes it's to give very specific policy recommendations. So I think we should be aware of this, and I think we need to make sure that social work scholars understand that the that for the same reason they think research should have an impact on practice in the field. For example, how to deal with children with special needs, etc. I think social work scholars should also understand that their that their research can have impact on policy, and they should understand that the need not necessarily to do research for policy, but to be able to translate their research into policy recommendations or translate into ways that we can raise awareness through directly or through advocacy organizations. So that would be my, we had a very interesting experience over the last year in Israel. The Minister of Welfare, who was very open to our engagement and to our influence, established an advisory committee, policy advisory committee to him, which was made up of social work academics. And there we had the opportunity to directly use our research and our knowledge to have an impact on policy. And in fact, we did so and had in a number of issues, we in fact did have a very clear influence on the way policy was made. So sometimes you also need what we call opportunities. You need somebody there to let you sit at the table. We sat at the table, we had an influence. I don't know what's going to happen now, but that was what happened then.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to defer to my colleagues so that they'll have an opportunity to questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles. We turn next to Professor Hussein Latif, and Professor Latif directs the policy curriculum at the Brown School.
Well, thank you, Michael, and also thank you, John and Edith, for developing and producing this great text. I really enjoyed reading your book, and as my colleague Michael mentioned, you know, I'm a social work instructor for the foundation course in social welfare policy. So much of what I have to share in terms of questions for you stems from that position of being really, for many students, their first contact with social work in the context of policy as they aspire to be social workers. So with that, you know, I really appreciated the conceptual model that you all have developed to try to understand and explain how social workers become politically engaged. And I think similar to Sarah's questions, my questions for you really stem from the bracket of the motivation component of how that influences social workers' engagement in policy. And I thought what was interesting is that I didn't see much of a context or discussion on the real role of socio-cultural contextual stressors to explain how these may intersect with personality traits, gender, and ethnicity. And the reason I say this is that many of my students come from very diverse backgrounds, working with students who are from rural regions, students who are from marginalized ethnic or racial minority populations, our gendered populations as well. And what I have found in my experiences being an instructor is that when the institutional environment of social work students' education provides them with equitable opportunities to build motivation, then the explanatory contribution of gender, ethnicity, and personality starts to diminish. And so I'm wondering, one, what your thoughts are about the context of social contextual stressors as it relates to education that may influence motivation. But second to that, the other real piece to it that I think is important, that I'm interested to hear what you have to say, is the economic pressures that often students may have upon graduation that may limit their sight in thinking about policy as a viable option for gainful employment. So again, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the role of still volunteerism in the process of some social workers having to think about how do we advance social policy engagement, as we've seen historically in social work's history, is that not all of it was able to function in an economic model.
Johnny, do you want to answer?
You can begin and I'll continue, or do you understand?
Well,
I'll start and you continue, okay?
Okay, okay.
Because, you're right. This is a great point in the sense that when we thought of environments and we understood how important they are to have their impact on motivation, on opportunities, on facilitation, then we thought about different sorts of environments, and I mentioned them when I gave the talk. But really what we've learned from the work of some of our colleagues, particularly on ethnicity, and to a certain degree on gender, that really the cultural environment is very important. So of course, people that come from different cultures they come from a culture or a situation of oppression or racism, or people who come from marginalized communities, of course, or from different cultural backgrounds, of course, have more difficulty in gaining the sort of motivation, in gaining the self-efficacy to engage in policy. And this is something that I think it's very, very important that as social work educators, we must be aware of. I mentioned our colleague, Hani Neumann, who has been doing work with the Arab community and the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, the Jewish ultra. And she's been really looking at the ways in which culture and disadvantage have an impact on not only motivation to engage in policy, but also an impact on the sorts of policy engagement people want to engage in. So I think that's a really important point, both on a sort of a theoretical level, but also very, very important when we think of how social work educators, if they're interested in providing sort of sense of self-efficacy to engage in policy, something they should be very much aware of, particularly if these people are going to go back into their own communities and need to have a policy impact. Sorry, Idit, your turn.
No, what I want to add is when I teach social workers, in Israel, the master level, they are social workers. They come to us after they receiving the BSW's bachelor degree, and they have the license to work as social workers, and then they come to us for the master level. And I teach practicum course on the master level. In our track, we have special track for human rights and social policy. And in my class, I have women, I have men, I have Arab students, and each of them bringing his own world. So the women, even if they come from more privileged groups, we need to do a lot of works on what it means to be a woman in politics, or woman doing politics. What are our self-image? What are we think about politics? How women are socialized to be in politics, arenas. So we have to do things. If I have to do special efforts only because they are women, and then there are women and Arabs. So what does it mean for me to be Arab social workers and to do something that criticize the municipality that I belong to, or the states, with the complex relationships that exist between me as Arab women in the Israeli society. So for me, it's like something that is going on all the time when we have a class of different gender and ethnicity and so on. So I don't know if I answer, but okay.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Again, thank you for the text.
Thank you, Hussein.
Okay, thank you very much, Hussein. So we turn next to Riccardo Guidi, coming to us all the way from Italy today. Riccardo, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks very much for inviting me in this wonderful discussion. Well, I have not time enough to say everything I wanted, but first of all, thanks, Idit, and thanks, John, because this is an outstanding publication and it's so robust book, full of examples, full of evidences, really easy to read. And I think it's the real reference for academics and practitioners. I particularly enjoyed the renewed attention to the environments of social workers' policy engagement, because in my opinion, this is very relevant because it helps fully understand the complex connections between social workers' daily practice of policy engagement and the big structural and contextual factors. And so from the book, we learned that different aspects of the context affect the features of social workers' policy engagement, opportunities, facilitation, motivation. And I think that this aspect of the book will be especially important for future comparative studies. And I would like to ask you something about this, because your theoretical model is not limited to Israel. It has an international validity, and actually it is used by many researchers in different countries. Your model is formal and abstract, but it works well for designing a survey through a questionnaire. And currently, researchers from Italy, Germany, Switzerland, at least, are using a readapted version of the questionnaire you designed. So your model and the consequent research instruments could be used as a common toolbox for a big global comparative effort, which fully considers the peculiarities of the context and recollects internationally standardized data on social workers' policy engagement. This would be very challenging, I know, but maybe not impossible. In the last pages of the book, you've wrote that one of the hardest challenges to face is about the global validity of the model. Sorry, I have the kids here. And the global validity of the model, I agree, this is a real challenge. And in reading the book, I was thinking about how the translation of the book in Italian would be difficult. Nevertheless, that challenge is about almost every theoretical model in social sciences. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, the book designed a research program that goes beyond the methodological nationalism. And I think that giving this aspect a value is crucial. So my question is, could the next book disseminate the results of a big global comparative research with common framework, data, and analysis, and including at least some Western countries which are different for their crucial environmental threats? To put it differently, if you had $2 million, could you do it? What would be the next steps and the crucial gaps to fill? Thank you very much.
So just before he did say something, Ricardo, can we come to Florence and work on the book? Is that all right?
Of course. I thought to ask the mayor of Florence if he could give you the honorary citizenship or the key of the stadium.
Okay, fine. Idit, please, sorry.
Okay, so this is when Johnny and I wrote the book, we said it's a framework and it's not model. Framework, it means that we put the categories, and then scholars around the world will put the specific variables in each of the components of the model. And so there is a lot of work of further research to find the specific variables in each of the components that relevant to each country or each nation. But if we want to do, it's a very complex research, because then we need to compare between different countries with different welfare regimes. So if we can take the environments, for example, countries with different welfare regimes, countries with different social problems, social policies, countries with different characteristic of the profession, because this is the third components of the environments, and with different opportunities, then we go to the other three. So it means different political culture and rules, formal and informal rules that determine the access. So it's a very complex research to do in order to validate all the model. But we look forward for this. I think that this will be our next challenge. To maybe we can't do everything together, but for the question, for example, is there a connection between the welfare regimes and the way the profession is characterized, and then how social policy engagement incorporate in the profession? It's a question that we are struggling with a lot of years, but this is the next step.
So I think the answer was yes to your question, Ricardo.
And what else, Johnny, except yes?
Yes, yes.
Yes, what?
Yes, we'll give it a go. If we get $2 million.
Okay. So.
Okay. Ricardo, do you have another question?
No. I would have.
Ricardo, can I ask you to ask me the questions about the transformative trend?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Yes,
So,
yes. Well, I would have a lot of questions. Yes, one other is, yes, it appeared that in the last few years, we have had a lot of studies about policy engagement or social work, but the question could be, is this a new phenomenon emerging from the ground, or is this about that researchers or academics, or we, generally speaking, are more sensitive to this topic? Is something really changing in the world of social work, or is it simply that we are more sensitive to this topic?
Okay. So
Okay.
So I want very much to answer this question because there is undoubtedly more sensitivity for policy engagement among social work scholars today. There is really much more research on the topic, and it's much more sophisticated. And I think this reflects really the growing international scholarly community that we have from North America, from Europe, Germany, Italy, the Czech Republic, Switzerland, and Israel, and from Australia and China, India, South Africa, and even Ethiopia. And I know that we have some scholars and PhD students from Ethiopia today. So members of this community are devoting much effort to better understand social workers' policy engagement in the different routes we mentioned before. So with regard to research, conceptualization, and theoretical efforts, I can say without no doubt that there is a transformative trend in social work community. The same can be said with regard to the social work education. I think that substantial and often innovative growth can be seen in the last decades in the social work education on policy engagement. And if I think of myself as an undergraduate and graduate social work students in the 80s, the difference is really dramatic. Because when I graduated, there was lack of socialization on policy engagement. And I think policy was only, the background for understanding our service user problems and not as a target for change. But now in Israel, there is no school of social work without special course on policy practice. And we know that this trend is also occurring in other countries as well. But the question, does this reflect a transformative trend in social work practice? This is a complex question for me, and this is the reason I wanted you to ask me, because I ask myself this question on a daily basis, and sometimes I have more positive answer and sometimes less. I think that we can certainly speak about change but not necessarily describe it as a transformative trend. I think there is a change in the way street-level frontline social workers perceive their policy role and the level of engagement in policy, particularly at the local level. And since there is more legitimation in the international and national discourse, more education, more recruitment efforts on the part of the professional organization, and the NSW is a very good example of this, there are more tools and awareness among social workers that yield higher level of engagement. But I think that we will be able to talk about transformative trend in social work practice when much more social workers hold policy change position inside and outside government. And more importantly, when more social workers perceive their job, his or her job, as including policy engagement, and almost each of them will be able to incorporate policy work to one degree or another in their routine practice. And this need not necessarily to be their prime practice, but rather an additional intervention to be employed in order to increase the quality of life of service users and more effectively address social problems. And I think that in order to achieve this, the social work profession still has a long way to go. And it was important for me to say that. So thank you, Ricardo, for the question.
And thank you, Idit, for the answer. It was very a rich answer. And I'm going to now speak on behalf of the participants who have posed a number of questions along the way. I'm going to try to. I can't do justice to all of them, but there were some good questions. So on behalf of the participants, and everyone should feel able to answer these, both the authors of the text and also the panelists. So whoever has an observation. So one thing that came out was that social workers in most social work jobs are already overwhelmed. They have big caseloads. They can't keep up with what they're doing. So how are they supposed to have time to do policy work? And related to that, another question was, what can social work agency administrators do to facilitate this kind of work among their staff? Because they're supervising their staff are behind in their work. How should an administrator of an agency handle this if she or he is interested in engagement in policy? So those are tough questions.
So I will start with the managers, Johnny, and because I feel and I think, and from my experience as a teacher of policy practice, that the environment, the organizational environment is crucial. And it's very important to create atmosphere and to create the space for policy engagement. And social workers cannot engage in policy practice without their administrators that provide them the time and the resources to do that. And we see it in Israel, for example, a few years ago, one of the head of the social services, local social services in one city in Israel, invite us to work with his social workers in the service in order to expand policy practice. So it comes from him, from up or from above. That's the word, from above. And then it's really facilitate the motivation of the social workers to be engaged in policy. But I think that the social workers, and I didn't say it before in the presentation, can impact their managers, and they impact the facilitation. So if social workers can encourage their administrators, please Let us do this job. It's important. It's a one more intervention that's relevant to help our service users, so then they can put some pressure on their managers to create the spaces for engagement. Last week, I had students that want to write a letter to the welfare minister in Israel about something that she saw that adversely affect her service users. It takes at least 3 or 4 weeks to convince the supervisor and then the dover, spokesperson of the municipality to agree. But she pushed pressure and then they agree. So, and I believe that if it happens once, then it can happen again. So basically my answer is that there is a lot of things to do from the administrative to facilitate space, to make, to give not socialization, education for the social workers that want to engage, to encourage them, but also the social workers can affect the administrative and push for and ask for or request for policy engagement. And I even think that if new social workers come to employee, at least in Israel, there is a shortage. There are a lot of positions that no social workers want them. And they will say to the organization, I agree to accept the job, but please let me do at least 2 hours a week policy practice. Maybe it can work.
Maybe just to add on that what's important, what sometimes is unclear to social workers or to students is that when they think of policy, they think what they have to do is to begin a process and to lead that process, continue that process until policy is changed. But what we're trying to say to students is that this is not the case. You work with other people, you work in coalition with other social workers, with service users, with advocacy organizations. Your role can just be to begin to get the ball rolling, or your role can just to give one idea about the new policy. We don't think social workers who are overwhelmed everywhere in the world, in the United States and in Italy and in Israel, we understand that. We don't expect them to spend all their time in policy or most of their time, or even do policy on a regular basis. But when the need emerges, when they see that there's a problem that affects a lot of their service users, they can initiate the process, or they can work with other people and spend not all their time, but a little bit of their time trying to deal with an issue that doesn't affect only one person. It's not an individual problem. It's a problem that affects a lot of people. And the last thing I'll say is that very often agencies, organizations need to engage in policy because policies or what happens around them affects them and their service users, and they want social workers to affect policies to make sure they can do their work, the service can do their work, its work better.
Mm-hmm. And I want to add something that sometimes I see it not through research, and I think this is the subject for further research, is to look at the implication of engagement in policy practice, because I can see that social workers that engage in policy practice are less burdened and their quality of life in the work increase because they feel that they do something big, that they impact more than one client. So sometimes it's not a burden afterwards. It's like something that give the social workers more energy to continue their professional job. But this is a subject to research.
Okay, excellent answers. I really appreciate that. Keep bringing things back to also the importance of evidence in building this perspective. So offering not just opinions here, but based on what we know about social work practice, then we try to chart a more positive direction. There's another series of questions that are kind of overlapping, but I'll try to summarize, and because I think this is also really important. There's the challenge of doing research on policy, and also the challenge of teaching policy practice is fraught a little bit with the potential to slip over into what I would call political work. And Charles uses the term political social worker to define his own work, and he is very much a political social worker. But there is a risk, both doing academic work and doing professional training, that we get characterized as having a political agenda, and by political here I mean a party agenda, an agenda for one perspective but not other perspectives. Now this is difficult, of course, because social work has values, and we're against racism, for example, and so we might teach critical race theory, and somebody in the political world will respond to that. We have that as one of the participants brought up very clearly here in the chat. We have this problem in the United States. Even when you're not teaching something that's political, it will be characterized as political, because critical race theory is an academic perspective, quite sensible interpretation, and largely accurate about what's going on in American history. So how do you think about this as presenting political social work? How can people navigate both in collecting evidence and in promoting policy and in teaching and instruction? How do we navigate in this the political world where we might be characterized as being partisan, where some of the people responding, especially in some of the red states in America, will interpret it as being political? This is complex ground, especially for people who are teaching in public universities in the United States at the present time. So your wisdom here would be really helpful.
But at least in where we teach in social work, we have students who have very different political views. And of course, this is we want to be able to reflect the values of social work, and at the same time, not to be partisan in the way that you describe. I think we can get around this to a certain degree, by doing research that we think is important, that reflects our values and reflects the issues that we think are important, but doing good research. So we should be able to do good research, valuable research. Research is really based strongly on evidence, that we can make a convincing case, and to try to do this to further the issues, social justice issues, the issues that we think are important, or to deal with issues that we think are important. We don't use the term political social work, at least when we think about policy issues. Luckily, in English, unlike German or Italian, you can differentiate between policy and politics, and we do so, and we think that we can deal with policy issues, identify issues that are important, reflect our values, but also do good research that is based on evidence and can make a convincing case for thinking about issues and maybe thinking about policy. So it's an issue, and last week I taught on history of the welfare state, and I mentioned the Soviet Union or Lenin or Marx at one stage to try to explain the way that the welfare state emerged. And somebody came up to me and said, why do you always say good things about communism, nothing good about capitalism? But I was just explaining the history of the welfare state. It wasn't a political statement. So of course it's a difficult issue, but I think if we do good research and we stick to our values, and we deal with issues that are important, I think we can have an impact and not necessarily be identified politically. But I know that in the United States, with red and blue states, it's perhaps a bit more difficult than where we come from.
Well, I feel I put the political issue on the table, so it's there. But at least in my practical classes, we started from a problem that the social workers see from their service users. So they bring the subject from the field. So then it's a problem in the policy that they can see, and it's not a matter of party. This was this. They identify the problem. They see that there is not enough. For example, one of my Arab students now is dealing with institutions for young women from the Arab society that don't have a culturally sensitive shelter for them. So it's a problem that she see. Okay, it's something, and so it's come from the field, from the service users. So what is the partisan issue here is not all the time is very serious in that case. I don't know if I answer, but we use the word political. I use the word political social workers, political social actors, but not in a meaning of partisan, but a meaning as political as we describe it at class, as who decide who get what, when, and when, something like that. So.
Okay, excellent comments. I think, if I could just add a summary comment here, this is sort of fraught territory for all of us, really. I think probably everybody on this call has a few bruises on their shins for operating in this territory, and it's so I think to some extent it's inevitable that some people will accuse us of being partisan when we, from our perspective, are just teaching or doing research on something, getting evidence, trying to teach effective practice, representing social work values. So there'll be some times when this kind of tension just happens, and I think also that requires a certain amount of clarity and determination on our part to just quietly continue to do what we think is the right thing to do. So unfortunately, we've used up all of our time here today. Really excellent. It's an excellent book. Really fine discussion. I want to thank the main speakers. I also want to thank all the panelists for being here and adding real value. I would like to do another session like this and have more voices from other people. I think it's truly important. And we're trying to expand. I give you credit, John and Idit and Ricardo, for expanding this discussion outside the United States, especially in Europe, to a really significant extent. I think in many ways, you're ahead of us. And there have been times in US history when social workers were very much leading in policy. And I think we haven't been in that time recently as much. So maybe with your examples and our a little bit of determination from people like the people on this call, that we can again move social work into being more engaged in policy and representing social work values in forming society. So that's the hope in this session and the hope in your textbook, I know. And so again, that I'll remind everyone that a final slide here will have the discount code for the textbook. The textbook is When Social Workers Impact Social Policy and Don't Just Implement It. If you haven't read the book, it really is a fine book, and if you're an instructor, I think can be a really valuable tool. So thanks again to everyone, and with that, we will sign off. And there'll be a final slide with information. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Michael. Bye-bye.